The 2018 Summer Institute in Migration Research Methods provided 8 days of training in the use and analysis of migration data at UC Berkeley, targeting early career scholars. The Institute drew local and national experts to train attendees and provide on-site mentorship. Most participant costs were covered thanks to an award from the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
I want to make the case that to the extent that sometimes we have quantitative and qualitative divides, when it comes to ethics and migration, there really is a common concern that we all have to deal with, and that the conversations that used to be in parallel, I think, are increasingly overlapping. But there's sort of three basic pillars. This is privacy and confidentiality. So making sure that any data that is collected by researchers is kept confidential, and so that you are not broadcasting this personal information. Protection from harm, which maybe even should be the first one. I mean, our very first obligation, I think, as ethical researchers is to protect people from harm. And then informed consent. And so with the exception of maybe some psych experiments where people do deception, the idea is that if you invite people to participate in research, they should be informed in terms of the purposes of the research and they should consent to it. Now this raises interesting questions when we think of administrative data, because the people whose administrative data has been collected have never consented necessarily to having that data released, especially when it's released by governments. So that's sort of a bracket, and what do we think about that as researchers? So there's that set of obligations, and then on the other hand, there is a set of obligations as a researchers to what I would call scientific accountability. And so this is very much the idea that as a researcher, your data is supposed to be open to peer scrutiny, right? So if you send your article for review, peers are going to evaluate it and see if the analysis is sound, whether the data collection is sound. If you send your book manuscript to a university press, again, there's going to be a series of reviewers who are going to look over it. And they're not only looking at your theory, they're obviously looking at your methods, and they are supposed to be the ones who are the gatekeepers that say, wait a second, this analysis isn't really the way it's supposed to be. Once it's published, again, the idea is that you are supposed to be open to scrutiny, and for quantitative researchers, if someone comes to you and says, I'd like to replicate your findings, you might have an obligation to give the data set. Or at the minimum, you might have an obligation to give them the coding for the statistical regressions that you are running. And increasingly, for a lot of funding agencies, you must make that data publicly available, again, if it's like a survey-based thing, and that accessibility has to be part of the plan that you give to the granting agency when you say you're going to be collecting this data, right? So there is this assumption about that. There's also a move among ethnographers for the exact same thing, right? So the exact same idea of it should be open to scrutiny, and then debates about, does this mean that your field research should be open? Should you put your notes online? What are you supposed to do with all those oral interviews? And then there's both a question of, I guess, judgment on the quality of the analysis, but then also a question of history and longitudinal studies. And so to the extent to which you might archive your oral history interviews, people could come back in a number of years, 10, 20, 30, and actually look at those oral history interviews. And so here at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley, we have an entire department devoted to oral history, and they have, for example, interviews with immigrants who are working in the canneries in Monterey about 100 years ago, 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And so that's actually a data source. And so there's also this issue in terms of our obligations to future generations, as it were. When there are conflicts between ethics and the wider world, they might be of two varieties, right? The first is ethics and the wider social world. And what do you do, for example, about confidentiality when someone in the wider social world, especially enforcement people, want that data? But there's a whole new set of issues now about this idea around transparency and replicability. And there I don't think that IRBs or funding agencies have thought enough about what migration research in particular brings to the table in some of these issues. And again, I think this is both quantitative and qualitative. One of the topics that we're going to be talking about is imputation. And so what do you do as a researcher if someone comes and says, we want to replicate your findings? Do you make that available or not? What if a funding agency says, you have to put your data up, or you have to give your do files or your R programming code. What do we do? And then obviously we also have those same kind of questions when it comes to ethnography and qualitative research. Previously we might have thought that anyone who is like a status less than LPR might be vulnerable, or only the undocumented, but now we've gotten in a situation that it's like LPRs are vulnerable, even people who are citizens are vulnerable depending on who they have in their families. And so this just sort of augments these questions. So
I've been working primarily with Central American populations from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And they just so happen to be also the three groups that have come under multiple attacks under this administration. So this, of course, puts me in a very delicate position, because I've been interviewing these three groups for a very long time. What is ethics in research on immigration? Irene mentioned the three basic principles. And those three basic principles, voluntary participation, do no harm, and confidentiality, is what the IRB basically requires of all of us. How do we do these three things? That is the basic thing that it's required, is the basic principles that are required for us from the IRB. But how do we apply those to our projects? Do no harm in the context of collecting data directly from immigrants, but also about immigrants. This question goes hand in hand, of course, with the confidentiality rule and with voluntary participation. Do no harm. There's so much involved in this, because given the expansion of the enforcement system, more and more people have come under scrutiny. We have mixed status families, of course, where everybody is under the radar. But we also have co-workers. We have the immigration enforcement has encroached more and more people. Dana Fisher argues that we should do, and again, I'm talking about ethnography, but I think this applies more broadly. She argues that we should do work as if we had a legal team watching over our shoulder. I think we should do research as if we had an ethical and a moral team watching over our shoulders. How do you guarantee do no harm? Think of multiple scenarios that through your research you could put someone in danger, and it doesn't matter how far-fetched you think this is. We are at a time, we're living in times where things are far-fetched. You can provide information that you have to really think about this. That is not going to reveal individuals' identities. So, for instance, in my work here in San Francisco, I was able to disclose that I was doing research in San Francisco because no one in what I wrote can be identified at all. I don't think it's pretty, I think I assure that no one can be identified. For my interview participants, for my study participants, I provided a first name and the initial of a last name, but all pseudonyms. None of these were real, but the name of the city was real. So I did not have to mask that. Even though some of my study participants wanted their own names to be revealed, I couldn't do that because I wanted everybody to have the same de-identified names. If you're doing research in a small town, like I am doing right now in Kansas, we're doing an ethnography in Kansas, and that is a very delicate ethnography because we have women and some men who have been released with ankle bracelets in that town. We cannot go far enough in protecting everyone in that town. We're calling that town Wheatville. One of my, and it is a team ethnography that I'm doing with 2 doctoral students, and the one who is a native Kansan chose that pseudonym. We are being so careful. At first, we were giving more or less where, not where the town is located, but it's within X hours of X city. But now we're not even saying that because people start to try to guess. So now we can only say that it's Eastern Kansas. That's it, nothing else. Because of the we don't know actually the uncertainty of what may happen. So if it's a small town, if it's a large city where you're doing research, you can give the name of the city without any further down details. If it's a small town, I did the same thing in Guatemala when I did an ethnography in Guatemala. I used pseudonyms for the names of the towns as well. That has some analytical implications as well, because if you don't give the real name of the town, you can't really describe the specific context. And for me, context figures pretty centrally in my work. But that's a decision to make. How much information do I give about the place and what I'm doing ethically in terms of protecting people's identities? The topic of your research determines how much you're going to reveal about your project to others, how transparent you can be. I have of course I have obligations to my research community to share findings and to share what I have collected. But I also have this huge responsibility to my study participants at a time when you're not just, I don't mean to say that other research is not of consequence, but at this particular time, to reveal information about immigrants, not only undocumented immigrants, can put people in a life or death situation, because to me, deportation is you're removing someone, detention, you're removing someone indefinitely from their own families and communities. So in my view, you have to be, there's no precaution enough to guarantee the 3 principles that the IRB starts with. You have to always go beyond that. I cannot stress enough the extra steps to take in ensuring the 3 principles that IRB begins to require.
Some of the ethical issues that Jim and Claire, have run into in terms of imputing legal status in secondary data sets. Jim and I were working on a project for several years, and I think Claire was involved and is increasingly involved in this as well, where we're trying to take existing data from the Census Bureau or from the National Center for Health Statistics and then use the information in the data to impute some kind of legal status, even though legal status was never asked originally in those data, in the questionnaires. And so this has raised a number of questions about privacy, confidentiality, and general ethics of using data for purposes that were never collected for in the first place. So on the plus side, just in defense of what we're doing, oftentimes I start a talk and I say, why is it that we're studying the undocumented population? And I have a picture of a guy who's sort of in the shadows, right near the border, and I put that picture up, and it's a hidden population. And I feel that sometimes we have the obligation to tell the stories of people who are hidden and don't have a voice of their own. And so if we want to understand inequality and the factors that relate to the outcomes that we're seeing for these people, that we do need to understand when it is related to legal status that we identify it as that way. And instead of, legal status happens to be correlated with language proficiency and poverty and education and duration of residence. But those things alone don't put these people in the jeopardy and the positions that they're in. It's really legal status, and it's the U.S. government and the systems that they're entrapped in that are leading to the positions and statuses that they have, now. And so if we don't call it for what it is, I feel like that is an ethical concern, right? So we do need to be, saying, we need to tell the truth, basically, is what I'm saying. On the other hand, though, we have run into situations in our work where, for example, in our work using health data that was originally collected to monitor the health of the population and to, they never asked people about legal status. And so when we go to the IRB and the ethics review boards for the National Center for Health Statistics, they're very uncomfortable with us using the data that they collected and recoding it in a way then that seeks to identify, even on a probabilistic basis, whether they're undocumented or not. And there's several reasons why. First is privacy, and they consider it's not a confidentiality issue or concern because we can't identify the actual people in the survey. But it is a privacy concern because people may not have willingly given up their personal information in a questionnaire, knowing or expecting that it would then be used to identify something as sensitive as legal status. And so there's that. So you're sort of breaking your trust with the people that were originally in the survey and agreed to be in the survey. And then this leads to a bigger issue for these data collection agencies. So the National Center for Health Statistics and indeed many of the federal statistics data that, are being collected in this country and probably other countries as well by the governments, they put a lot of effort, time into gaining the trust of the population so that they can go back out into the field and collect more data. And so if word got out somehow, whether it was true or not, that they were collecting information on legal status, they worry, that the response rates are going to go down. And so, not only, I think their concern is legitimate. If we go and publish data and we publish a report that has legal status in it, even though it wasn't actually collected in the survey itself, people would honestly, they would get the impression that they actually were collecting that information, and it could scare away future respondents. And so it's not an IRB issue necessarily, but it is something that you have to think about in terms of the larger harm to our data and statistical system.
Yeah.
And so I get it. We tried to argue that it wouldn't be as bad as they thought. So in the end, we lost. So we didn't get the IRB approval to do some of this work. Even though there was no confidentiality concerns. You're probably aware of the citizenship question that's being proposed, or at least mandated now, to be on the 2020 census. And what this is going to do, there's a lot of things that we think it might do, and it might result in lower response rates. But what it will do actually in the end is produce the resulting data that will come in will have citizenship status at an unprecedented level of geography. Do you know what I mean? Okay, and so the census is obligated to produce reports that drill down to the smallest level of geography that's possible without giving out individual identities of people. And so we're talking the block group level, And so that's like 3 or 4 city blocks. And so we would know the numbers of U.S. citizens and the numbers of non-citizens at the block group level when this is done at the end of the 2020 census. So this is a couple of years after. This reminds me a lot of if you go back to the 1940 census, and at that time, that was 100% count. And so that was sort of what we call our long form, but it was asked of 100% of all households. And so they had a lot of really, I would call it nice information for researchers, but also nice information for enforcement officers. And so they wanted to find out where all the Japanese Americans lived. And all they had to do was look at the census and find out. And then they would go to those neighborhoods, and those were the neighborhoods they targeted for the internment. And so, all legal. It was all collected. And it was used for a reason that many of us would think was unethical, right? So I guess the question I have is, even if we maintain the privacy of individuals and we maintain the confidentiality of individuals, if we release information at the block group level about citizens and non-citizens, can whole groups then be targeted because of the unprecedented level of geographic detail? So some of these things don't come up in IRB reviews, because most of those IRB reviews are focused on the individual harm. Yet I think some of the harms that we're talking about here for these issues that we've dealt with have to do with harm to the statistical systems, harm to whole groups. And so those are just things that we've had to consider. And I can't say that we've solved this problem, because on the other hand, I think there's also an ethical concern with not telling the story and not collecting the data.
Thank you for watching. Please watch the other videos in the series using the links below.